Hi, I'm Shawn and I'd like to welcome you to this installment of our 30-day Deep Trance Identification Challenge. And in this episode, we'll be showing you how to build your very own event matrix for your very own model. Now, what is an event matrix? Well, it's simply a matrix of the events that you've identified in the life of your model, organized according to the logical levels as they apply to those events. So, for example, you have your model, and from your model's life you've chosen, let's say you've chosen 7 events for the sake of argument. You've chosen one event that shows how the model built their beliefs and values from their childhood. You've chosen 2 events that show how they learn their particular skills. You've chosen 4 events that show how they applied those skills and developed those skills even further. So there's 7 events. And each of those events we're going to organize according to the logical levels of the context, their behavior in the context, their state, their emotional resources and skills in the context, their beliefs about themselves and the world around them in that context, their values, what's important to them in that context, their identity, who they are in that context, and how they connect to the universe at large, to the people around them, society, to God. We sometimes call that beyond identity. So we'll get a matrix that looks something like this. For each of the events in the life of your model, you're going to construct the levels associated with that particular event. Now, this is a really important point, because you may think, well, surely the model has the same values for their whole life. That is almost certainly not the case. For example, if you think about an early event in childhood when they were learning their skills, the value which they have in that event might be to learn, to grow. Whereas if they're applying that skill later on in their life, the value might be very different. It might be to help people or entertain people or to create something new, depending upon who your model is. So each of the levels may be very different for each of these events. So you choose the first event in your model's life and you go, well, where did this take place? What was the time, the place, the context? Who else was there? And you note that for that event. And then you say, well, what was the behavior of your model in that context? And you make a note of that. What was their emotional state, their emotional skills? Now, you may not explicitly know that. It may not say that in their biography. So you kind of have to step into their experience and say, what must they have been feeling to have behaved that way in that context? Next, what are their beliefs? What do they believe about themselves and the world around them? And again, you may not know that explicitly. You may do if there's an autobiography. They may say, I believe this, but they may not. So again, you may have to step into their experience and say, what must they have been believing about themselves and the world around them in that context? Next step, what are their values in the context? What has to have been important to them to have behaved in that way? And then their identity, who were they in the context? And what was their connection to the universe? So if we take the example which Jess used in a previous video, young Thomas Edison. He goes to see his mother and he asks his mother if he can build a science lab in the basement of their house. Okay, so we have the context, Thomas Edison and his mother conversation. We have the behavior. Thomas Edison, a small boy, I think he's like 5 or 6 or 7, I think he's 7 years old, going to his mother and asking his mother if he can build a laboratory in the basement of their house. That's the behavior. Now, if you step into the shoes of a 7-year-old child, going and asking their mother if they can build a laboratory in the basement of the house, what must his emotional state have been? A state of confidence, a state of certainty that he would get what he wanted, a state of passion to explore and experiment. You can step into that experience and you can say, well, as I step into that experience, I think he must have had this emotional state. This is what I'm feeling when I step into that experience. What are the beliefs which he must have held? A belief that the most important thing in the entire world is to learn, perhaps. What's important to him in that context? Personal growth, learning, experimentation, finding out for himself. You step into that experience and you make a determination what must have been important to him. Who was he as a person, as this 7-year-old boy in that context? And what's his connection to the universe at large? So you go through each of the events, you go through that process for each of those events, and you put that whole thing together and you get your event matrix. And in the next few episodes we'll show you how to use that in the Deep Trance Identification process. So we'll see you in the next video.